He showed up to one of the most expensive private jets in America, carrying a beat-up canvas bag held together by fraying stitching and old habit. The billionaire who owned that jet took one look at him and ordered her security team to search everything he carried before he could take another step. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that inside that worn bag was a federal grounding order with her aircraft's tail number printed at the top, and the quiet man holding it was the only person on that tarmac with the authority to decide whether her $40 million jet ever left the ground. If this story has your attention, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning Mason Ryder drove to Falcon Ridge Executive Airport, his truck made the same grinding noise it had been making for 3 weeks. Something in the front left wheel bearing that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing because there was always something more urgent. A school permission slip on the kitchen counter, an inspection report due by Friday, an 8-year-old boy who had asked at breakfast whether they could go fishing this weekend, and Mason had said maybe, which both of them understood to mean probably not. He pulled into the employee lot just after 7, engine still ticking as it cooled, and sat for a moment with his coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder. The airport was already awake. Ground crews moved across the tarmac in the pale morning light, fuel trucks threading between aircraft, a Citation taxiing toward the far runway with its nav light still blinking. Mason watched all of it without really watching any of it, the way you do when something has become familiar enough that your eyes stop recording and just confirm. He was not a tall man or a particularly imposing one, medium height, broad through the shoulders in a way that didn't read as gym-built, but rather as someone who had spent years doing things that required physical effort. His face was the kind that settled into patience. Not blank, not bored, just still. Brown eyes that didn't hurry. 43 years old, though the lines around his eyes pushed that number higher. He'd been out of the Navy for 7 years, and if you didn't already know where those lines had come from, you probably wouldn't ask. The canvas bag sat in the passenger seat. It was a bad color, some greenish-brown that might have once been olive drab, and the stitching along one shoulder strap had been repaired with a different thread that didn't quite match. His ex-mother-in-law had offered to buy him a new one, twice. He'd thanked her both times and kept this one. It had belonged to his wife. Not for any sentimental reason he could easily explain to another person, but because Laura had bought it at an Army surplus store for $14, and it had survived more than everything else in his life. And that meant something to him, even if he couldn't put words around what. He picked up his radio, confirmed his credentials with the airport operations desk, and got out. Falcon Ridge catered to a specific type of client, the kind who considered commercial aviation an inconvenience rather than a service. Its terminal was smaller than a nice hotel lobby, but finished to the same standard: polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling glass, a lounge area with leather chairs that cost more than Mason's monthly mortgage. Private aviation was its own economy, and Falcon Ridge sat comfortably in the upper tier of it. Mason's work brought him here roughly twice a month, sometimes more. He operated as an independent inspector, contracted through the FAA's approved third-party program to conduct safety reviews on private and charter aircraft. The work suited him. It was methodical, it mattered, and it left him alone to do it without a lot of organizational noise around him. This morning's assignment was a Gulfstream G650ER registered to Sinclair Aviation Holdings. Tail number N4-470SH. The aircraft had been flagged during a routine data pull, a maintenance discrepancy in the pressure control system that had shown up in the aircraft's automated monitoring logs 3 weeks prior and had not been signed off as resolved. That kind of open item was the sort of thing that usually got cleared in 24 hours. 3 weeks of silence meant either someone had forgotten or someone had decided not to remember. Mason had read the discrepancy report on his tablet the night before while his son slept, and the TV played something he wasn't watching. He'd read it twice. Then he'd made a phone call. The federal grounding order was in a sealed envelope in the inner pocket of the canvas bag. He was crossing the tarmac toward the Gulfstream's position when he first saw the activity around it, and immediately understood that this was not going to be a quiet morning. There were 7 or 8 people clustered near the aircraft's main stairs: a ground crew, 2 men in dark suits who had the specific posture of private security, and several others he pegged as executive staff. The jet's cabin door was open, The air stair extended. An auxiliary power unit hummed somewhere underneath. Everything about the scene said departure imminent. A woman stood at the center of it, and even from 50 yards, Mason could see that she was the kind of person rooms organized themselves around. She was talking on her phone, one hand moving as she spoke, the other holding a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched yet. Her suit was the color of charcoal, well fitted. She was maybe 30, he thought, younger than he'd expected, though he hadn't exactly been expecting anything. Dark hair pulled back. The confidence in her posture wasn't performed. It was just there. The way height is just there. That was Aurora Sinclair. Mason had not done extensive research on her beyond what was necessary for the inspection. He knew she'd built Sinclair Aviation Holdings from a fleet acquisition and a calculated bet on the premium charter market at exactly the right moment. She was on the cover of things. She had opinions people paid to hear. Beyond that, he didn't particularly care. His job was the airplane, not the owner. He kept walking. One of the suits noticed him first and stepped forward. He was built for the role. Wide-necked, expressionless, the kind of man who had learned that physical presence did most of the talking. "Stop right there." He didn't yell it. He didn't need to. Mason stopped. He held up his credentials wallet, the FAA-issued photo ID and inspector's badge in the clear plastic sleeve. "Mason Ryder, I'm the assigned safety inspector for this aircraft. I need to conduct a review before departure." "We're aware of the inspection," the security man said without looking at the badge. "It was scheduled for 8:30. It's 7:15. I moved it up. Operations was notified." He'd called in at 6:45 before he left the house, while his son was still eating cereal. "You can confirm that." The suit didn't move. "Who authorized that?" "Falcon Ridge Operations. Tom Aldridge." Mason kept his voice even. He'd done this kind of thing before. Not always, but often enough. Sometimes people wanted the inspection. Sometimes they tolerated it. Sometimes they treated it like a customs search at a border they felt entitled to cross without stopping. Aurora Sinclair had ended her call. She was walking toward them now, and the way she moved suggested that she was not accustomed to conversations happening in her vicinity without her involvement. "What's the delay?" she said. She wasn't asking the security man. She was looking directly at Mason, but speaking in the tone of someone asking a question that they expect another person to answer on behalf of the obstacle in front of them. "No delay," Mason said. "I'm here to complete the pre-departure inspection on your aircraft. Once it's done, we'll know whether the aircraft is cleared for flight." She looked at him for the first time. Actually looked, the way you do when something has said something unexpected. Her eyes moved from his face to the canvas bag to his jacket, a plain navy windbreaker, the kind sold at outdoor supply stores, and back to his face. "You're the inspector." "Yes?" Something shifted in her expression, though he couldn't quite name it. It wasn't contempt exactly. It was more like the involuntary recalibration people did when something didn't match the expectation their minds had already built. "David," she said, not looking away from Mason, "I need you to check his bag before he goes anywhere near the aircraft." The security man, David, turned to Mason. "Sir, I need you to open your bag for inspection." Mason considered this for a moment. "I'm a federal aviation inspector with active credentials on a filed inspection order. You don't have the authority to search me. We have the authority to control access to a privately owned aircraft," David said. Mason could have pushed it. He probably would have won. But winning the argument wasn't the job. He set the bag down. "Be careful with the sealed envelope in the interior pocket. It's an official document and it doesn't need to be opened by you." David crouched and unzipped the main compartment. Inspection tools and foam cutouts, a tablet in a padded sleeve, a folder of printed documents. He reached for the interior pocket. "Don't break that seal," Mason said again. David's hand paused over the envelope, then withdrew. He zipped the bag and stood. "He's clean," he said to Aurora. Aurora nodded once, then looked back at Mason. "We have a hard departure window. My team has been prepping this aircraft since 5 this morning. Whatever your inspection involves, I need it done in the next 30 minutes. "I'll need however long the inspection requires," Mason said. A beat of silence. "You're not understanding me," Aurora said, and her voice had acquired a specific texture, patient and precise, the way a person speaks when they're willing to explain something once. I have a meeting in New York at noon, a meeting that has taken 4 months to arrange and involves— I understand you have somewhere to be, Mason said. So does everyone on your aircraft. I'd like all of you to get there safely. He picked up his bag. I'm going to start with the mechanical bay. Voici. He found what he was looking for in 42 minutes. The pressure control valve in the bleed air system was a component about the size of a large fist, threaded into a manifold assembly in the aft mechanical compartment. It regulated the flow of pressurized air from the engines into the cabin. Too little, and the pressurization failed. Too much, under the wrong conditions, and you had a cascade problem that could escalate fast at altitude. The valve currently installed was not the valve that belonged there. Mason crouched in the compartment with his flashlight at an angle and looked at the part number stamped into the housing. Then he looked at it again. Then he pulled the maintenance log from his bag, found the page he'd flagged the night before, and confirmed what he already knew. The original valve had been replaced. The replacement carried a part number from a different manufacturer, one whose components had been the subject of an FAA advisory bulletin issued 8 months ago, flagging a microfracture issue in units from a specific production batch. The bulletin had not constituted a mandatory removal order, but it had required documentation of any installed units and a monitoring protocol. There was no such documentation in the maintenance log. No notation, no acknowledgement. He took photographs. He measured. He documented. He pulled the comparison unit from his bag. He'd brought it specifically for this inspection, sourced it from a parts supplier 2 days ago when he'd first seen the discrepancy report, and held it next to the valve in the compartment. Under the flashlight, the hairline fracture in the comparison unit's housing was visible if you knew where to look. He knew where to look. He climbed back out of the compartment, walked to the air stair, and went up into the aircraft. Aurora was inside, working at a fold-down desk with her laptop open and 2 phones on the surface beside her. She looked up when he entered. "Well," she said, "I need you to step off the aircraft, please." She closed the laptop slowly. "I'm sorry?" "The aircraft is grounded. I'd like you and any crew members to step off while I complete the documentation." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that preceded something. "You're grounding my aircraft." "Yes." "Based on what?" "A pressure control valve in the bleed air system. It was replaced with a unit from a manufacturer batch under FAA advisory. No documentation, no monitoring protocol. I can walk you through the specifics once we're off the aircraft." She stood. She wasn't a tall woman, but she had a way of adding height to herself that Mason recognized as a trained behavior. The controlled stillness of someone who had learned that presence was a weapon. "Do you know what's at stake today? Do you have any idea what this meeting—" "Miss Sinclair." Mason kept his voice level. "I'm not grounding your aircraft because of a scheduling preference. I'm grounding it because if that valve fails at altitude, your cabin loses pressurization over the Atlantic corridor and your pilots have seconds to begin an emergency descent. That's what's at stake." She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to see your authority document," she said. He reached into the interior pocket of the canvas bag and withdrew the sealed envelope. He broke the seal himself, unfolded the single page, and held it toward her. She took it. She read it. Her jaw tightened once, and then her expression settled into something controlled and cold. "Get my team on the phone," she said, not to Mason. "I want legal on the line in 10 minutes. "That's your right," Mason said. He put his bag over one shoulder. "The aircraft stays grounded until the valve is inspected and either cleared or replaced with an approved part and documented properly. Legal can't change that." He started toward the air stair. "Who do you think you are?" she said behind him. He paused at the top of the stairs, not because the question deserved a pause, but because he was choosing his words carefully, which he always did. "I'm the inspector," he said. "That's all." He went down the stairs and stood on the tarmac in the morning light with his canvas bag and waited for what came next. The legal team arrived in the form of a phone call, not people, a voice on speaker that introduced itself as Warren Chalk from Sinclair Aviation's General Counsel Office, clipped and confident in the way that lawyers on retainer always were, like they'd been woken up and weren't going to let you forget it. Aurora stood on the tarmac 15 feet from Mason with her phone held flat in her palm, the volume high enough that he could hear most of it without trying. Walk me through the specific citation, Chalk said. Aurora looked at Mason. He's asking you. Mason had his own phone out, pulling up the advisory bulletin reference. FAA Advisory Bulletin 24-08-117, issued 8 months ago, covers bleed air pressure control valves from Meridian Aero Components. Production batch codes MR-440 through MR-461. The valve currently installed in your aircraft carries batch code MR-447. The bulletin requires documentation of any installed units, scheduled monitoring, and a sign-off from a licensed A&P mechanic on each inspection cycle. He paused. None of that paperwork exists in the maintenance log. A brief silence on the line. The bulletin was advisory, not mandatory, Chalk said. An advisory bulletin doesn't constitute a grounding requirement. The grounding order isn't based solely on the bulletin, Mason said. It's based on the absence of required documentation for an aircraft seeking to depart in the next 30 minutes. Under FAR Part 91.409, an aircraft cannot legally depart when open maintenance items haven't been resolved and signed off in the logbook. The valve replacement itself, whenever it was done, has no sign-off. No mechanic's certificate number, no date, no approving signature. That's not an advisory violation. That's a record-keeping failure that makes the airworthiness status unknown. Another silence, longer this time. He's citing 91.409, Chalk said, apparently to someone else on the line. I heard him, a second voice said. Aurora's eyes hadn't left Mason's face. There was something in her expression he couldn't categorize cleanly. It wasn't pure anger, which he'd seen enough of to recognize. It was more layered than that. It had frustration in it, and calculation, and underneath both of those, something that might have been the earliest edge of actual concern, though she was working hard to keep that buried. Mr. Ryder, Chalk said, returning to the call, we'd like to propose a temporary fix. A licensed mechanic can be on site within 2 hours to complete the appropriate documentation retroactively, clearing the maintenance record and allowing departure. Mason almost said something. He chose not to and let the silence do it for him. That's not how maintenance records work, he said finally. You can't retroactively document a valve replacement that happened at an unknown date by an unknown mechanic. A new inspection and a new sign-off on what's currently installed is the minimum. And that still doesn't resolve the underlying question of whether the installed component is safe to fly. Which is your opinion, Chalk said. Which is a factual question about a physical object, Mason said. And the answer to that question requires someone to open the compartment and look at the part. That hasn't happened yet today because we've been on this call. He heard Aurora exhale through her nose. Warren, she said, I need a minute. She walked away from the phone, not far, 5 or 6 steps in the direction of the terminal, enough to put her back to Mason. He watched her press her fingers against her forehead and hold them there for a moment. Then she turned around. How long? She said. Not hostile, exactly. More like someone who had accepted the first round of bad news and was calculating how bad the second round was going to be. To do it right, a full inspection of the bleed air system by a licensed mechanic, documentation completed and verified, and my review of that documentation before I lift the order. He did the arithmetic in his head. 6 hours minimum, probably 8. 8 hours. She said it quietly, like she was testing the weight of it. Then, that's not a delay. That's a cancellation. I understand. Do you? She wasn't being rhetorical. She was actually asking. This meeting, the person I'm flying to New York to see has been trying to get this on the calendar since February. He's 71 years old and he runs 3 investment funds that together hold more than $8 billion in active assets. He's going to take one look at a missed meeting and make a decision that I won't be able to walk back. I'm sorry about your meeting, Mason said, and meant it. Not in an elaborate way, not as a performance of sympathy. He just meant it the way you mean it when something genuinely inconvenient is happening to another person, and you can acknowledge that without it changing anything. Are you? She said. Yes, and the aircraft still can't fly until the inspection is done. She looked at him for a long moment, and it was a particular kind of look, the kind that was measuring rather than judging, trying to find the angle, trying to locate the lever that made him move. What's it going to take? She said. quiet enough that the ground crew 20 yards away couldn't hear. Mason understood what she was asking. He'd been asked versions of it before, not usually that directly, but the shape of it was the same. Someone with resources looking at someone without many, doing the math. "Nothing," he said. "That's not what this is." "I'm not suggesting anything improper," she said, though the flatness in her voice suggested she understood that he understood exactly what she'd been suggesting. "I'm asking what it would take to resolve this faster." "I already told you what it takes." He gestured toward the aircraft. "And faster isn't really the right word. Correctly is the right word." She turned away from him again, and this time she called someone else. Not the lawyers. A man named Derek, from the sound of it. She spoke in lower tones, and Mason moved away out of range, not because he needed to give her privacy, but because he had work to do. He went back to the mechanical compartment with his camera and his notebook and continued documenting. Chechi. It was Derek Foss who arrived at the aircraft 40 minutes later. Sinclair Aviation's director of maintenance operations. A thick-necked man in his late 50s who wore his age in his knuckles and his eyes and moved around aircraft the way people move around things they know well and don't entirely trust. He had a rolling tool case and a hard-sided binder, and he didn't introduce himself to Mason, just climbed into the mechanical bay and started looking. Mason stood back and let him look. After 4 minutes, Foss climbed back out. His face had the specific closed-off quality of a man who had just confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. "When did this get replaced?" Mason asked. "I don't know," Foss said. "It's not in the log." "I know it's not in the log." "Do you know who did it?" Foss looked at him for the first time. Really looked. "I think I have an idea." "You want to tell me?" Foss set his binder on the top of his rolling case and opened it. He flipped through pages, past printed forms and maintenance schedules, until he found what he was looking for. A work order dated 6 months ago, signed by a mechanic named Pulaski, that referenced a bleed air system inspection but contained no notation of a component replacement. Foss held it out, and Mason looked at it without taking it. "The work order shows an inspection," Mason said, "not a replacement." "Right. So either the replacement happened at a different time and wasn't documented, or it was done under the cover of this inspection and the work order was written to not reflect it." Foss didn't say anything. "Derek," Mason said. He kept his voice neutral, but he wanted to be clear. "I'm not investigating you right now. I'm investigating the aircraft. But if you know something about how that component got there, and that information isn't in any record anywhere, then we have a problem that's bigger than one valve." Foss closed the binder. He looked out toward the terminal, where Aurora was visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass, still on her phone, still moving. "There was pressure," he said, "last spring. Costs were running high, and there was pressure from above to find savings in maintenance budgets without compromising the schedule." He stopped. "I pushed back. Somebody else found a way around the push. Pulaski. I don't want to name anyone. His signature is already on the work order," Mason said. "His name's already in the record." Foss picked up his tool case. "What do you need from me?" "I need a licensed mechanic to do a full inspection of the bleed air system right now, with you certifying the work. I need documentation of what you find and what the current status of that valve is. And I need it done to the standard you'd want it done to if you were the one getting on the airplane." Foss looked at him for a moment. "Give me 90 minutes. "I'll be here," Mason said. He got coffee from the terminal. Not the good kind, the paper cup kind from the self-serve station near the operations desk, and sat on a bench near the windows where he could see the aircraft and let his mind rest without going quiet. This was something he'd trained himself to do in the Navy, in the stretches between things when the temptation was to either push through on adrenaline or let yourself go slack. Neither worked. You had to find the middle ground where your body stopped, but your awareness stayed present. His phone showed 2 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and one from his son's school. He called the school back first. "Mr. Ryder, this is Pam at Holloway Elementary. Caleb's fine. I just wanted to let you know he forgot his lunch again." "I'll call his grandmother," Mason said. "She's closer than I am today." "Of course. He's a sweet kid." "Thanks, Pam." He texted his mother-in-law, not his mother, but Laura's mother, Sandra, who had become something essential in the years after, The kind of essential that doesn't get discussed directly because naming it might make it seem like a transaction when it wasn't, and got back a thumbs up emoji and a picture of a sandwich she'd already made, which meant she'd probably been expecting the call. Sandra knew him well enough to anticipate his failures, which was one of the more humbling forms of love he'd encountered. He was putting his phone away when Aurora Sinclair sat down on the bench beside him. She didn't ask permission, she just sat, the way people who were used to owning rooms sat in spaces they didn't technically own. Her coffee was in a real cup now, porcelain with a logo, brought to her by someone he hadn't seen deliver it. "You have a child," she said. He looked at her. "Why? I heard you on the phone." "Yes," he said. "A son, 8 years old." She looked out the window at the aircraft. "Single?" "Widowed," he said. She didn't do the thing people usually did with that word. The slight intake of breath, the pivot to condolence, the recalibration of how to talk to him. She just nodded, the way you nod when something makes sense of something else. "How long have you been doing this work?" she said. 7 years independent. Before that, I was in the military, then worked a staff position with a regional charter operator for about 18 months. He paused. "I didn't love working on staff." "Why not?" He looked at her sideways. "You're going to ask me that?" She half smiled. It was the first one he'd seen from her, and it didn't match the rest of her face in the way smiles don't when they're genuinely small rather than performed. "Fair enough." They sat for a moment without talking. "My attorneys think they can challenge the grounding order," she said. "Find a procedural angle. Argue the advisory bulletin wasn't sufficient basis for your preliminary determination." "They can try," Mason said. "I'm right about what's in the log and what isn't. Any appeal goes to a regional FAA supervisor who will look at the same documentation I looked at and reach the same conclusion." "How confident are you?" "In what I found? Completely. In the fact that it's dangerous?" This was a different question, and he gave it a moment. "That valve is from a batch with a documented fracture tendency under sustained thermal cycling. I brought a comparison unit from the same batch. The fracture is microscopic, but it's there. Whether the specific valve in your aircraft has already begun to fracture, or whether it does so under load at 38,000 feet, is what the inspection will tell us. The point is, you cannot fly it without knowing." She held her coffee cup in both hands, turning it slightly. "If it passes inspection, if Foss goes in there and looks, and the valve is structurally sound, then what?" "Then I need the documentation completed correctly. I review it, and I lift the order." "And the flight?" "Is your business." She looked at him. "That's a very clean line you draw." "It's the only line I have." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The meeting in New York. I've been trying to position my company for a growth acquisition. 3 regional operators that would double our fleet size. The capital for that comes through Victor Langston. You may not know who that is." "I don't," Mason admitted. "He's one of the most significant private aviation investors in the country. He's 71, he's selective, and he has about 4 other opportunities competing for his attention right now." She set her coffee down. "If I don't walk through his door today, someone else will." "I'm sorry," Mason said, and the repetition of it didn't make it less true. "I don't know how to help you with that." "I'm not asking you to," she said after a moment. "I'm just telling you, because you seem like someone who might want to know what they're actually costing, beyond the abstract." He thought about that. He understood what she was doing, and he didn't particularly hold it against her. People under pressure used the tools they had. She was using information, using the human weight of consequence, trying to put something in his mind that would shift the scale. It didn't shift the scale. "The passengers on your aircraft would have a cost too," he said. "If I did this differently?" She didn't answer that. Foss came back in 88 minutes, not 90, which told Mason something about the man's standards, even when he didn't fully want to be on display. He had a completed inspection report in the hard-sided binder, and his face was the face of someone who had been hoping to find the news was better. "The valve has a fracture," Foss said without preamble, standing outside the mechanical bay with the binder open to a page of photographs. "Thermal stress, not deep enough yet to constitute an immediate failure risk under normal operating conditions, but under sustained cycling at altitude," Mason said. "Yeah." Foss closed the binder. "Under cycling, it's cracked, Not catastrophically, but it's cracked. Mason took the photographs and looked at them. Close up, well lit, the fracture visible as a dark line in the housing, curved along the stress axis exactly as the advisory bulletin had predicted. He handed them back. I'll need the full report and your certification number, he said, and the valve needs to come out. I know, Foss said. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I know it does. What happened next was less a confrontation than a compression. The moment when all the pressure that had been building since 7 in the morning found the smallest possible space and filled it completely. Aurora was standing near the air stair when Foss and Mason approached together. She read the situation correctly before either of them said a word. The posture, the binder, the particular way Foss was not making eye contact with her. She had the specific stillness of someone bracing. Tell me, she said. Foss told her. He showed her the photographs. He explained what the fracture meant and what it didn't mean and what it could mean under the wrong circumstances. And he did it in the language of a man who had spent 30 years around aircraft and understood exactly how to make someone understand what metal does when it fails. Aurora looked at the photographs for a long time. How did this happen? She said. Her voice had changed. Not broken. She wasn't that kind of person, or at least not in public, but the authority in it had receded and what was underneath was something more unguarded. Someone replaced the original valve with a unit from the wrong batch and didn't document it, Foss said. I know that part. I mean, how did that decision get made? Foss looked at his shoes. Someone was trying to save money and keep the schedule intact. On a $40 million aircraft. Yes. She handed the photographs back to Foss. She looked at Mason. Her jaw was tight, and there was something moving behind her eyes that she wasn't letting out. And Mason recognized it as the particular experience of realizing that a system you trusted had been failing without your knowledge, which was different from discovering your own failure. It was almost worse, in some ways, because it also meant you hadn't been paying attention in the right direction. When can the valve be replaced? She said. Not to Mason, to Foss. We don't keep approved stock on site. Nearest supplier is in Fort Worth. Rush shipping, we're looking at end of day at the earliest. Realistically, tomorrow morning. She turned away from both of them and stood with her back to the aircraft, looking at the terminal, looking at whatever was inside her head, and neither man said anything because neither man had anything useful left to say. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face changed again. A quick tightening, the way faces do right before something difficult. She answered it. Victor, she said, I know, I need to explain something to you. Mason took his inspection report in his canvas bag and walked back toward the terminal, leaving her to her call. He had documentation to file and a regional FAA supervisor to brief, and a grinding noise in his wheel bearing that wasn't going to fix itself. Behind him, he could hear her voice, still controlled, still professional, but with an effort in it now that hadn't been there at 7 in the morning. Some days cost more than others. He knew that better than most people. He pushed through the terminal door and the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the building settled around him, and he found the nearest chair and sat down and called his son's school back to make sure Sandra had shown up with the sandwich. And she had, because Sandra always did. And that was one less thing in the world that had gone wrong that morning. He opened his laptop and started writing the inspection report. And outside on the tarmac, the Gulfstream sat still and silent in the late morning sun, going nowhere. The inspection report took Mason 2 hours to write. Not because the findings were complicated, but because they had to be exact. Every word in a federal document was a word that could be read by a lawyer, a judge, an investigator, or a family. And that last category was the one that kept his writing careful. He'd learned early in this work that the way you wrote about a failure was a form of respect for everyone who might be affected by one. He was still at the terminal when his regional supervisor called. Gary Tillman had been with the FAA for 26 years. And had the voice of a man who had absorbed a lot of bad news without letting it change his baseline temperature. He was based out of the regional field office in Dallas, and Mason reported to him on any grounding order that carried potential systemic implications, which this one did because a maintenance falsification wasn't a single aircraft problem. Walk me through it, Tillman said. Mason walked him through it. The valve, the batch advisory, the missing documentation, the fracture in the comparison unit he'd brought. The confirmation from Foss's inspection, the work order with Pulaski's signature that didn't reflect a replacement that had clearly occurred. You think it was deliberate, Tillman asked. The documentation gap? The work order was written to describe an inspection, not a replacement. Either the mechanic made an error in the paperwork, which is possible, or the work order was written to obscure what actually happened. I can't tell you which one from where I'm standing. But the replacement itself was deliberate. Yes. Someone made a decision to use an off-advisory list component. That doesn't happen accidentally. You have to source the part, order it, install it. That's 3 separate decision points where someone chose to use something they shouldn't have. Tillman was quiet for a moment. How many aircraft in the Sinclair fleet? 14 active, based on their operating certificate. Mason had already looked this up. Mix of Gulfstreams and Bombardiers. If the cost-cutting pressure was systemic and this wasn't a one-time decision, then other aircraft could have similar issues. That's a significant statement. I know, I'm not making it as a conclusion. I'm making it as a possibility that warrants attention. Another pause. Mason could hear the sound of papers moving on Tillman's end. File the full report by end of business today, Tillman said. I'm going to loop in the Flight Standards District Office. This may go broader than a single grounding. Understood. Mason. A shift in tone. Still professional, but with something more direct underneath. This is going to make some people unhappy. It already has, Mason said. I mean people with more resources than an unhappy executive on a tarmac. Mason closed his laptop. I know what I found, Gary. The report's going to say what I found. Tillman made a sound that might have been agreement or resignation or both. File it by 5, he said, and hung up. He didn't see Aurora Sinclair again that afternoon. Her team had moved back inside the terminal. The security detail, the assistants, the people who organized the space around her. And at some point, the private car that had been idling near the terminal entrance drove away. And Mason assumed she was in it, though he didn't track it. He had work to do, and she wasn't part of the work anymore. The aircraft was grounded. The order was filed. What happened next was above his pay grade in every sense. He drove home in the late afternoon with the wheel bearing making its noise and the sun low enough to hit the dashboard at an angle that required his visor in the down position and his eyes slightly squinted. He stopped at a grocery store and bought ingredients for the pasta dish his son reliably ate without complaint, which narrowed the options considerably, and got home 20 minutes before Sandra dropped Caleb off. Caleb was 8 years old in the way that some 8-year-olds are, completely, without reservation, without the self-consciousness that would arrive later and change things. He came through the front door, dropped his backpack in the exact wrong spot, announced that Tyler Weiss had gotten a new video game, and described its mechanics in more detail than Mason could follow, and then asked what was for dinner, all in roughly 45 seconds. Pasta, Mason said. With the red sauce or the other one? Red sauce. Okay. He disappeared down the hallway, and Mason heard the particular sound of sneakers being kicked off in a direction that wasn't the shoe rack. Sandra lingered at the door. She was a compact woman in her late 60s, Laura's coloring and Laura's eyes, and Mason had a complicated relationship with that fact that he managed by not examining it directly. She looked at him in the way she sometimes did, not the way a mother looked at a son-in-law, but something more sideways than that, more considered. Long day? She said. Longer than usual. Did it go well? I found what I was looking for. He held the door. Thank you for the sandwich. He always forgets, she said, not unkindly. You both do. She left. Mason went inside and made pasta and listened to Caleb talk about Tyler Weiss's video game and tried to follow the parts about the upgrade system, which he mostly couldn't, and that was fine. He filed the report at 4:47 in the afternoon. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Mason did 3 other inspections. A Cessna Citation at a small regional airport outside Fort Worth, a Pilatus PC-12 that turned out to be exactly as clean as its owner claimed, and a Beechcraft King Air with an avionics discrepancy that took the better part of a full day to trace to a wiring splice someone had done with the wrong gauge wire 2 maintenance cycles ago. He picked Caleb up from school on 2 of those days and missed it on the 3rd because the King Air ran long and Sandra covered. He called in a favor with a mechanic friend to get the wheel bearing looked at, and was told it needed to be replaced and that it would cost more than he'd wanted to spend this month, but less than he'd feared. He didn't hear from Sinclair Aviation. He didn't expect to. What he did hear on the third day was from Tillman. The FSDO opened a formal investigation, Tillman said. They're reviewing maintenance records across the full fleet. That was fast. Your report was thorough. It gave them enough to justify the broader action without having to build from scratch. A pause. There's something else. The FSDO investigator spoke with Derek Foss this morning. Foss provided additional documentation, records he'd been keeping separately from the official maintenance log. Mason sat up from where he'd been leaning against the workbench in his home office, which was less an office than a room with a desk in it that also contained Caleb's outgrown bicycle and a water heater. He was keeping shadow records? Apparently. Over the past 18 months, Foss had documented a series of maintenance decisions that he flagged internally as potentially non-compliant. He raised the issues through internal channels 3 times. He received responses each time that were, in the FSDO investigator's words, directive in nature, instructing him to defer to executive maintenance scheduling decisions. Someone told him to back off. Multiple times, in writing. Tillman's voice had the particular dryness of a man who had seen this pattern before. He kept copies of everything, the emails, the directives, the original flagging reports, everything. Who sent the directives? That's still being worked out. But the chain goes up past the maintenance department. Mason looked out the window at his backyard, where Caleb had left a soccer ball in the middle of the lawn 3 days ago, and it was still there because neither of them had moved it. How far up? That, Tillman said, is the question. Bulked out. The answer to that question arrived not through official channels, but through a phone call Mason received the following morning from a number he didn't recognize, the second time in a week that had happened. He answered it because he always answered unknown numbers. In his experience, the calls worth ignoring were the ones from numbers you knew. Mr. Ryder, a woman's voice, professional, precise, with something careful underneath the professionalism. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm the operations director for Sinclair Aviation Holdings. Mason set down his coffee. Ms. Donovan, I know you don't know me. I got your contact information from the FAA Field Office Directory. It's public record. I'm calling because I believe there are things relevant to the current investigation that you should be aware of, and I'm not certain they'll reach you through official channels in time to matter. In time for what? A brief pause. Aurora Sinclair's legal team is preparing a counter-narrative. They're planning to argue that the maintenance failures were the result of unsanctioned decisions made by individual employees acting outside their authority. Specifically, they're preparing to characterize Derek Foss as having operated independently and without executive oversight. Another pause. Shorter. That's not accurate. You have information to the contrary. I have documentation, emails, meeting notes, budget directives. A paper trail that shows the maintenance cost reductions were not rogue decisions. They were policy, approved at the executive level, with full knowledge of what was being deferred. Mason took a breath and let it out slowly. Ms. Donovan, I have to ask, why are you calling me? This sounds like information for the FSDO investigator. I'm going to bring it to them, she said. I have an appointment tomorrow morning, but I wanted to speak with you first because she stopped. And when she continued, the professional precision had a crack in it. Because I've been in this company for 4 years. I know what's in those records, and I know what they mean. I flagged safety concerns through internal channels 6 months ago and was told to focus on operational metrics. I kept copies of everything because I didn't know what else to do with them. A beat. I just wanted someone who understood what they were looking at to know that the documentation exists before anyone tries to make it disappear. Is that a risk? I don't know, she said. Maybe. Probably not. But I've been thinking about it for 3 days and I couldn't not call. He understood that. He'd been in situations where you did the thing that needed doing, not because you were certain it would matter, but because not doing it was worse than the uncertainty. Can you get me copies of the documentation? He said. I already sent them to a secure email I set up for this. The address is in my contact signature. A pause. Mr. Ryder? Do you think any of this is going to change anything? I think the investigation is going to go where the evidence takes it, he said. That's usually not a satisfying answer. No, she agreed. It isn't. Yet, he read what she sent him that evening after Caleb was in bed. He sat at the desk in the room with the water heater and the bicycle and read everything twice. Claire Donovan had not been exaggerating the scope of it. What she had assembled over 18 months was a meticulous archive of the gap between what Sinclair Aviation said about its maintenance practices and what those practices actually were. Budget directives that specified maintenance cost reduction targets by percentage. Internal email threads where those targets were received and acknowledged by department heads. Follow-up emails where specific deferrals were proposed. Specific components, specific aircraft, specific scheduled replacements pushed back or replaced with cheaper alternatives, and where those proposals were approved. In one email chain, someone in the executive tier had responded to a flagged safety concern with a 3-word reply. Manage the schedule. Mason found the email chain that referenced the bleed air system on aircraft N4-470SH. The original flag had come from Foss 7 months ago, notifying his supervisor that the pressure control valve was nearing the end of its recommended service life and should be scheduled for replacement. The response from above was not a maintenance authorization. It was a budget note. Cost compare alternatives. 3 weeks later, a purchasing email showed an order for components from Meridian Aero, not the OEM manufacturer, but cheaper, and from the batch that was already under advisory review. The order had been placed by someone named T. Garrett in the Executive Procurement Office. Not by Foss, not by Pulaski, not by anyone in the maintenance department. Mason sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. He'd been doing this work for 7 years, and he'd seen maintenance failures of most kinds. Fatigue failures, resource failures, training failures, the ordinary human entropy of organizations that grew faster than their systems could handle. He'd seen some deliberate cutting of corners, though less than people who didn't work in the industry assumed. Most of the time, the gap between safety and failure was filled with good intentions and bad judgment, rather than malice. This was different. This had the shape of a decision made by someone who understood the risk and priced it against the cost, and concluded that the cost savings were worth the risk. That was a moral calculation, not an operational one. And the person making it had been sitting somewhere with a title and a salary well above Mason's pay grade, approving line items and a budget, protected by enough organizational distance from the actual aircraft that the human beings on board those aircraft probably never occurred to them as more than a capacity metric. That was the thing that stayed with him, sitting in the quiet of the house with Caleb asleep down the hall. Not the anger. He'd learned not to spend a lot of energy on anger because it was expensive and didn't improve the output, but the specific weight of knowing that somewhere up the chain, a human life had been converted into a cost variable without the person who made that conversion ever having to look at the aircraft, never having to stand in the mechanical bay and hold a flashlight to a fractured valve and understand what it meant in terms of altitude and time and the seconds between a warning light and an emergency. He closed the laptop. He checked on Caleb, a habit, automatic, the kind of parenting that happened below conscious thought. His son was asleep on his side with one arm hanging off the mattress in the specific graceless position of a child who had gone out completely. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment and then went back down the hall and went to bed. The formal review session was scheduled for 9 days after the initial grounding. The venue was a conference room at the FAA's Fort Worth Regional Field Office. Not a hearing, technically, but a structured review with legal representation on both sides, FSDO investigators, and invited technical witnesses. Tillman had called Mason 2 days before and told him he was expected to present his findings in person. "It's going to be contentious," Tillman said. "Sinclair's legal team has been active." "What's their position?" "They're claiming the grounding was based on an advisory bulletin that didn't constitute mandatory action, and that the maintenance discrepancies, while serious, were the result of individual employee decisions that didn't reflect company policy. They're also calling into question whether your preliminary inspection met the procedural requirements for a federal grounding order." "The order met every requirement," Mason said. "I know that. You know that. They're going to argue it anyway." Tillman paused. "They've also been asking questions about your background. Your military service, your independent contractor status, whether you had any prior relationship with Sinclair Aviation or any competing operator. I didn't. I know. I told them that. A beat. Mason, this is going to be the kind of room where people try to make the story about you instead of about the valve. You need to be ready for that. Mason had been ready for versions of that his whole adult life. In the Navy, the story had sometimes tried to be about him, about whether he was the right person in the right place, whether his judgment could be trusted under pressure, whether the quiet ones were reliable. He'd learned that the best response to that kind of pressure was to become smaller inside it, not larger. To make yourself into the least interesting thing in the room and let the evidence be the interesting thing. I'll be ready, he said. He spent the day before the review going back through every document, every photograph, every line of the inspection report. Not because he'd forgotten anything, but because he wanted to know it the way you know a route you've walked in the dark. Not from memory, but from the body. He also called Derek Foss, not for any strategic reason, and not entirely sure why he was doing it, but he called. Foss picked up on the third ring. Ryder, how are you doing? Mason asked. A pause. Honest answer? If you want. I'm not sleeping great. Another pause. I've been with this company 6 years. Before that, I was at 2 other operators, 32 years in aircraft maintenance. And I kept those records because, I don't know, because I couldn't figure out what else to do with the information. I wasn't ready to go to the FAA, and I wasn't ready to quit, so I kept records. That was the right thing to do, Mason said. It didn't feel like the right thing. It felt like hedging. Sometimes they're the same thing, Mason said. You preserve the information. That's what matters now. Foss was quiet for a moment. You think it's going to matter? The review? I think the documents matter. The review is just the room where people look at them. You're not worried about what they're going to say about you in that room? Mason thought about it honestly. He was worried, in the way you're worried about things you can't control. He didn't enjoy having his qualifications questioned or his motives examined by people whose interests were served by his being wrong. Nobody did. But worry was information, not instruction. It told him to be prepared. It didn't tell him to change what he'd found. A little, he said, not about being wrong, about whether being right is going to be enough. Yeah, Foss said. That's the one. But the conference room at the FSDO office had the specific institutional quality of rooms designed for seriousness rather than comfort. Fluorescent overhead light, a long table with too many chairs, a projector screen that was already showing the case docket number when Mason arrived. He was 20 minutes early. So was Claire Donovan, who was seated in the back row of chairs along the wall, with a laptop bag on the chair beside her and an expression that was impossible to read from across the room. She was younger than he'd expected from the phone call, mid-30s, with the posture of someone who had been sitting in the back rows of difficult rooms for long enough that she'd learned how to take up exactly the space she was entitled to and no more. She looked up when he entered. Mr. Ryder, she said. Ms. Donovan. He sat in the chair near the front where Tillman had told him to sit. Thank you for the documents. Thank you for reading them. She looked back at her laptop. I've been up since 4. Me too, Mason said. The room filled over the next 15 minutes. Tillman came in with 2 FSDO investigators and a woman from the legal division. Sinclair Aviation's contingent arrived in a group, 3 lawyers, a technical consultant Mason didn't recognize, and 2 executives whose names he didn't know. Aurora Sinclair arrived last, alone, without the security detail and without the assistants. She wore a dark jacket and looked like she hadn't slept well in 9 days, which Mason thought was probably accurate. She sat across the table from him. Their eyes met briefly, and she looked away first, not as a defeat. He didn't read it that way, but as a choice, as if there was something she wasn't ready to do yet. The lead FSDO investigator was a woman named Patel, mid-40s, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on, and a legal pad covered in handwriting that she referenced constantly without looking like she was referencing it. She opened the session by establishing the scope, not a punitive hearing, she said, but a formal review of the grounding determination and associated maintenance findings with the purpose of establishing factual record. Sinclair's lead attorney, A man named Braddock, who wore his suit like he'd been born in it, began his objection before Patel had finished her opening. "We'd like to note for the record," Braddock said, "that the grounding order was issued by a contracted independent inspector without direct FAA staff oversight at the time of issuance, and that our client maintained serious questions about the procedural validity of that order." "Your objection is noted," Patel said, without looking up from her legal pad. "Mr. Ryder, please walk us through your inspection findings." Mason had brought a printed copy of his report and a tablet with the photographs. He started with the work order, Pulaski's signature, the description of an inspection that didn't mention a replacement, the absence of any documentation for the component that was actually installed. He explained the advisory bulletin. He showed the comparison unit's fracture under the photographs he'd taken. He described what Foss had found when he opened the compartment under Mason's supervision. He spoke in the same voice he used for everything, not flat, not clinical, just level, with the information in front of the words rather than behind them. Braddock interrupted 3 times. Each time, Patel told him to hold questions for the appropriate point in the session. Each time, Braddock made a note and settled back with the expression of someone who was keeping score. When Mason finished, Braddock had his turn. He questioned Mason's interpretation of the advisory bulletin. He questioned whether the absence of documentation was evidence of falsification or simply poor record-keeping. He questioned whether Mason had the authority to ground an aircraft based on a maintenance log gap rather than a confirmed component failure. He asked about Mason's contractor rate and whether he stood to gain professionally from high-profile groundings. Mason answered each question in the order it was asked. He didn't get defensive. He didn't embellish. On the question about his contractor rate, he said the number plainly and noted that his rate was the same regardless of whether a grounding order was issued. On the question about authority, he cited the specific FAR sections by number. Then Braddock made a mistake. "Mr. Ryder," he said, leaning forward slightly with the controlled confidence of a man who believed he was about to land something decisive, "isn't it fair to say that your entire determination, the grounding order, the maintenance falsification narrative, all of it, rests on the condition of a single valve? And isn't it also true that the valve in question was not confirmed to be fractured until after your order was already issued?" "No," Mason said. Braddock waited for more. Mason didn't give him more. "Could you elaborate?" Braddock said. "The grounding order was issued based on the absence of required documentation, which is an independent basis for grounding under 91.409, and doesn't require a confirmed component failure. The valve fracture, confirmed by Mr. Foss's subsequent inspection, is a separate finding that corroborates the concern that prompted the documentation review in the first place." Mason paused. "The order was legally valid before we opened the compartment. What we found when we opened the compartment explains why the documentation was missing." A short silence in the room. It was in that silence that Mason became aware of movement near the back. Claire Donovan had stood up and was making her way toward the table, and Patel was watching her, and Braddock was watching her, and the 2 other Sinclair executives had gone very still. "Ms. Donovan," Patel said, "you're scheduled for your statement following the technical testimony." "I understand," Claire said. "I just need to know, should I set up the laptop now, or do you prefer the printed copies?" She held up a USB drive in one hand and a thick-bound document in the other. She was asking a procedural question, but she was also, Mason understood, letting everyone in the room see what she was holding, letting them understand that she was there and she had what she had, and she was going to give it to the people who needed to see it. One of the Sinclair executives leaned over and said something quietly to Braddock. Braddock's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, a barely perceptible retraction, the way a person pulls their hand back from something that has turned out to be hotter than expected. "We'll start with the printed copies," Patel said. "Ms. Donovan, please take a seat until we're ready for you." Claire sat back down. Aurora Sinclair was looking at the bound document in Claire's hands. Her face was controlled, but her hands, flat on the table in front of her, had gone slightly rigid. The kind of tension that starts in the shoulders and travels down without the person noticing until later. She looked like a person who was counting something in her head and not arriving at a number she liked. Mason looked back at his own report. Outside the windows of the conference room, the Fort Worth afternoon was bright and specific, traffic on the access road, a plane visible on a distant approach path, the ordinary world going about its business at the altitude and speed it always did. He thought about the Gulf Stream sitting at Falcon Ridge, grounded. He thought about Foss in his tool bay, not sleeping. He thought about Caleb's soccer ball in the grass, still where it had landed. He thought about the fracture in the valve, that hairline crack in the metal, invisible to the naked eye at normal distance, only visible when you put a light on it at exactly the right angle. The way it only became real when someone decided to look. He thought about all the things that only became real when someone decided to look. The session continued. Patel asked her next question. Mason answered it. The afternoon light moved across the conference room table, and the documents waited to be seen. The printed copies of Claire Donovan's documentation ran to 214 pages. Patel had asked for them to be distributed before Claire's formal statement, and the sound of those pages moving around the conference table, the dry shuffle of paper passing from hand to hand, was the quietest thing Mason had heard all day, and somehow the loudest. He watched Braddock receive his copy and open it to the first page and go still in the specific way that lawyers go still when they encounter something they hadn't anticipated. Not shocked. Braddock was too experienced for shock, but recalibrating rapidly, behind a face that was trying not to show the recalibration. Across the table, one of the Sinclair executives, a man named Hargrove, whose title Mason had registered as Vice President of Operations during the introductions, picked up his copy and turned to a page near the middle, apparently at random, and then turned to another page, and then set the document down with a deliberateness that suggested he was controlling his hands. Aurora Sinclair had not opened hers yet. She was looking at Claire Donovan, who was seated at the end of the table now, laptop open, the USB drive inserted, waiting for Patel's signal. Claire wasn't looking back at Aurora. She was looking at the projector screen, where the first slide of her presentation was already loaded. A simple header, black text on white, reading, Sinclair Aviation Holdings, Internal Maintenance Communications, 18-month compilation. Ms. Donovan, Patel said, please proceed. But Claire had clearly done this before, not this exact thing, not in a federal review room, but the act of presenting difficult information to people who didn't want to hear it. She had that particular quality of controlled steadiness that wasn't the absence of nerves, but was the management of them. She started with context, her role in the company, her responsibilities, the point at which she had become aware that maintenance decisions were being directed from above the maintenance department. In the spring of last year, she said, I was included on an internal email chain regarding quarterly budget performance. The chain originated in the executive suite and worked its way down through department heads. My inclusion was incidental. I was copied because one item on the chain touched on ground operations scheduling. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a reproduction of the email chain in question, names redacted with black bars except for the senders and recipients Patel had cleared for disclosure. The relevant item was a directive to the maintenance department to identify cost reduction opportunities in the current maintenance cycle without compromising, and I'm quoting directly, customer-facing service metrics. What does that phrase mean in operational terms? Patel asked. It means the aircraft have to fly on schedule. The planes go when they're supposed to go. Whether they're maintained to the standard that keeps them safe at altitude, that's the part being asked to bend. Claire's voice didn't carry anger when she said it. It carried something more like exhaustion, the kind that comes from having understood something for a long time without being able to do anything about it. The directive didn't say to cut safety, it said to cut costs without affecting the schedule. In practice, when you tell your maintenance department to spend less money without changing when the planes fly, there's only one thing that absorbs the difference. She walked them through the 18 months methodically. Each email chain was dated, labeled, cross-referenced to the maintenance log records and budget approvals Mason had already documented. Where Mason's evidence showed what had happened to the aircraft, Claire's evidence showed who had decided it would happen and when. The two bodies of documentation fit together the way two halves of a document fit when you tear it and put it back together. Not perfectly, with some frayed edges, but unmistakably. The email from T. Garrett in Executive Procurement ordering the Meridian Aero components was on slide 11. Claire pulled it up and left it on screen for longer than the other slides. Thomas Garrett, she said, reports directly to the Chief Operations Officer. The purchase order was approved at the COO level. Braddock made a sound. Ms. Donovan, we'd object to any characterization that implies Mr. Braddock, Patel said, in a tone that was not unkind but had weight in it. Please hold your responses for the designated time. Braddock held them. Mason was watching Aurora through this portion. She had opened the document now and was following along, not trying to find the gaps, or not only doing that but actually reading. Her expression was not easy to interpret. He'd spent enough time around people in crisis to know that the face wasn't always a reliable map of the interior. But there was something happening behind her eyes that was more than calculation. Something that looked, intermittently, like genuine recognition. He thought, she either already knew this, or she is finding out right now in this room. He didn't know which one it was. He wasn't sure it changed what he had to do either way. Claire finished her presentation in 40 minutes. When she stopped speaking, the room had the kind of quiet that meant everyone was thinking, but no one was ready to say what they were thinking out loud. Patel made notes. Her legal pad was filling up. Braddock, when given his opportunity to respond, did what Mason had expected. He attacked the provenance of the documents, suggesting that records compiled unilaterally by a single employee over 18 months outside official channels lacked the evidentiary foundation to be treated as authoritative. He challenged the email chain interpretation, suggesting that language like cost reduction without affecting customer-facing service metrics was standard operational language that didn't imply safety compromise. He questioned whether Claire had the technical background to accurately interpret maintenance decisions. Claire answered the provenance question before Patel could direct it. Every document in this compilation has a corresponding original on Sinclair Aviation's internal servers, she said. The emails have header data, timestamps, and server routing information. I'm happy to provide the IT verification pathway. We're not in a discovery proceeding, Braddock said. No, Patel said, but we can refer to one if needed. She made another note. Ms. Donovan, you mentioned internal escalation. Can you describe the responses you received when you raised these concerns through company channels? Claire clicked to the final section of her presentation. 3 emails, sent over a 6-month period to different members of Sinclair Aviation's leadership, each flagging specific maintenance deferrals as potentially problematic. The responses were on the slide beside them. The first response said, "Thanks for flagging. Operations team is monitoring." The second said, "This has been reviewed at the appropriate level. Please coordinate with Derek Foss going forward." The third, and this was the one that made Hargrove look at the table rather than the screen, said simply, "Claire, please focus on your operational metrics and trust that maintenance decisions are being handled at the appropriate level. This isn't your area." RH. RH, Patel said. "Can you identify the sender?" "Robert Hargrove," Claire said, "Vice President of Operations." Nobody in the room looked at Hargrove except Mason, briefly, and what he saw was a man who had shrunk about 3 inches in his chair since the document had arrived, and was now doing the work of pretending he hadn't. Braddock leaned over to Hargrove and said something. Hargrove wrote something on a notepad and slid it back. Braddock read it and set the notepad face down. "We'd like to request a brief recess," Braddock said. "We'll take 15 minutes, Patel said. "What?" In the hallway outside the conference room, Mason got more bad coffee from a machine near the elevator and stood by the window that looked out over the parking lot. The afternoon had thinned into the kind of flat Texas light that didn't cast strong shadows, everything slightly washed out. He was tired in a way that wasn't physical, the kind of tired you got from sustained attention in a room where everyone was managing something. Claire came to stand near him. She had her own cup of coffee from the same machine. "That went about as expected," she said. "The recess?" "The whole thing. Braddock doing what Braddock does. Hargrove trying to be invisible." She drank her coffee and made a face. "I grew up in a house where my father kept every receipt he'd ever paid. Tax documents, utility bills, appliance warranties going back 30 years. I used to think it was excessive." She looked at her cup. "Turns out it just depends on what you need to be able to prove." "Is that why you kept everything?" Mason asked. "Partly." She was quiet for a moment. "Partly because I had a mentor early in my career who told me that in any organization there are 2 sets of records. The ones that are for public consumption and the ones that reflect what actually happened. He said the most important thing you can do is make sure those 2 things don't diverge too far. And if they start to, you write it down. She looked at the window. I thought he was being paranoid. I was wrong. What happens to you after this? Mason asked. Not as a strategic question, just as a human one. She considered it. I don't know. Probably not a long future at Sinclair Aviation. A slight, dry smile, which I'd already made peace with before I called you. She glanced at him sideways. What about you? Braddock's going to go after your contract status, your independent certifications. He'll probably file a complaint with the FAA about the inspection procedures. He can file it, Mason said. The inspection was clean. That doesn't always matter to the kind of pressure he can bring. I know. He looked at his coffee. It still doesn't change what I found. She nodded, and they stood there in the flat afternoon light finishing their bad coffee. And neither of them said anything else because there wasn't much more to say, and sometimes the absence of more words was its own kind of acknowledgement. When they filed back into the conference room, something had shifted. It was subtle. In the arrangement of the people on the Sinclair side of the table, in the way Braddock had repositioned himself slightly apart from Hargrove, in the fact that Aurora Sinclair, when she sat back down, sat differently than she had before the recess. More forward, less arranged. Patel reconvened the session and opened the floor for the technical testimony, which brought in the FSDO's own aviation safety inspector, a man named Cortez who had reviewed Mason's report and Foss's inspection findings independently. Cortez was not a dramatic man. He presented his conclusions the way you'd read a weather report, in measured declarative sentences with no editorializing. His conclusions matched Mason's. The valve was from an advisory-flagged batch. The fracture was real and documented. The maintenance log had no record of the component replacement. The grounding order was procedurally valid. Braddock asked Cortez 3 questions. Cortez answered them in a way that suggested he had anticipated all 3 and found them insufficient. Then Braddock did something Mason hadn't expected. He called a witness. Not a person in the room, a video call, set up on the projector screen. A man who appeared on the screen with the slight compression that video always did, seated in what appeared to be a well-furnished home office, bookshelves visible behind him, white-haired and sharp-eyed, and clearly accustomed to being the most significant person on whatever call he was on. Mason didn't recognize him, but he saw Patel's expression register something. Not surprise, but attention, and he saw Claire Donovan, across the table, go very still. Victor Langston, Braddock said, for the record, is joining us via video conference as a character and professional reference witness for Aurora Sinclair and Sinclair Aviation Holdings. Langston nodded at the camera once, acknowledging his name. Patel looked at her legal pad. Mr. Langston, your participation in this session is as a voluntary witness. You understand that this is a federal administrative review, and your testimony may be included in the official record? I understand, Langston said. His voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of someone who had spent decades ensuring that what he said was what he meant, and nothing else. Braddock began. Mr. Langston, can you describe your professional relationship with Sinclair Aviation Holdings and your assessment of the company's management? I can, Langston said. I've been in discussions with Sinclair Aviation for approximately 4 months regarding a potential investment. During that time, I've conducted due diligence on the company's financials, operations, and leadership. A pause, controlled. I was also scheduled to meet with Ms. Sinclair on the day the aircraft was grounded. And based on your due diligence and your professional experience, how would you characterize the company's operational integrity? Langston was quiet for a moment. It was a thoughtful quiet, not a hesitant one. I would like to answer that question in a way that's responsive to the full context of this session, he said, rather than the narrow framing you've suggested, Mr. Braddock. Braddock's expression remained composed. Of course. I've been in private aviation investment for 31 years, Langston said. I've seen companies at every point on the spectrum from exemplary to catastrophic. What you develop over that time is a sense for the difference between a company that has a problem and a company that is a problem. Another deliberate pause. I've been listening to this session for the last 40 minutes. The room was completely quiet. Before I joined this call, Langston continued, Mr. Braddock indicated to my office that my testimony would be helpful to Sinclair Aviation's position. I agreed to participate because I have a business relationship with that company that I take seriously. He looked directly at the camera, which meant he was looking at everyone in the room simultaneously. What I've heard in the last 40 minutes has caused me to reconsider several things, Braddock said carefully. Mr. Langston, I'm not finished. Not sharp, just clear. The documentation presented by Miss Bed. Donovan describes a pattern of decision-making that, in my professional judgment, constitutes a systemic failure of operational governance, not a rogue employee, not an isolated incident, a pattern, with a paper trail, that leads upward through the organizational chart. He paused again. I've also found myself thinking about something else. He reached forward and something on his desk changed, a window on his computer from the movement of his eyes, and then he looked back at the camera. I'd like to ask a question of the inspector who issued the grounding order, Langston said. Is he present? Patel looked at Mason. Mr. Ryder, Mr. Langston is directing a question to you. You may respond at your discretion. I'm here, Mason said. Langston looked at the camera for a moment. Your name is Mason Ryder. You were a Navy SEAL before transitioning to aviation safety work. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered it. Yes. I looked you up during the recess, Langston said. You certified airworthiness on 17 military transport aircraft during the Kessler Air Wing's operational deployment 4 years ago, under conditions I understand were significant. That's accurate, Mason said, not sure where this was going. The commanding officer of that wing submitted a commendation for your work. I found the public record of it. A beat. He wrote that you grounded 4 aircraft that the operational schedule required to be flying, under pressure from personnel significantly senior to your position at the time, based on your independent assessment of airworthiness, and that your assessments were subsequently confirmed correct in all 4 cases. Mason didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to confirm that, Langston said. I'm noting it for this room. He settled back slightly. In 31 years, I have learned that there is a category of person who holds a standard regardless of the pressure applied to abandon it. Not because they're inflexible, not because they lack the intelligence to see the consequences, but because they understand something about consequences that the people applying pressure have stopped understanding. He looked at his hands briefly. Mr. Ryder, in your professional judgment, is the maintenance failure at Sinclair Aviation an isolated incident or an indicator of a broader cultural problem? It was the kind of question that could be a trap, and Mason knew it, but it was also a straightforward question from a person who seemed to want a straightforward answer, and he didn't have a different gear for that. Based on what I found in the initial inspection, and based on the documentation Ms. Donovan has presented, I believe the maintenance failure on aircraft N4-470SH reflects decisions that were made at multiple levels of the organization over an extended period, Mason said. Whether that constitutes a cultural problem is a judgment that belongs to the investigators and ultimately to the company itself. What I can say is that the physical evidence and the paper trail point in the same direction, and that direction isn't toward a single bad actor. A silence. That's a careful answer, Langston said. It's the accurate one, Mason said. Langston nodded once. He looked at the camera. Looked at Aurora, Mason thought, though you couldn't be certain where a person's gaze actually landed through a video screen. Aurora, I think you and I need to speak privately after this session. Aurora said, Yes, and her voice was steady but thin, the way a voice gets when it's being held in place by will rather than composure. Mr. Braddock, Langston said, I don't think my testimony is going to serve the purpose for which you invited me. I'm going to stay on the call, but I won't be providing a character reference for the company's operational integrity at this time. A pause. That is not a decision I've made lightly, and it's not a permanent one. It's a decision based on what I've heard today. Braddock had the expression of a man receiving a bill he hadn't expected. Understood, he said. Ish. The session ran for another hour and a half after Langston's testimony. Patel was methodical and complete. She covered the procedural questions, the technical findings, the documentation chain, the chain of internal communications, and finally a summary of the next steps, which included a formal fleet audit of all 14 Sinclair Aviation aircraft, an investigation referral to the FAA's compliance office, and a determination on the grounding order for N4-470SH, which was sustained. Mason signed the documentation Patel put in front of him. He answered 3 additional clarifying questions from the FSDO investigator. He collected his printed report, he and his photographs, and put them in the canvas bag. When the session ended, people moved with the particular energy of a room that has been under pressure for a long time and is suddenly released from it. Braddock gathered his legal team in one corner. Hargrove left the room quickly, accompanied by one of the other Sinclair executives, and the way they left suggested they were going somewhere to have a conversation that needed privacy. Patel was on her phone before she'd finished standing up. Claire Donovan closed her laptop, removed the USB drive, and put it in her jacket pocket. She caught Mason's eye across the table and gave him a single nod, the kind that didn't need words around it. He nodded back. He was putting on his jacket when he became aware that Aurora Sinclair had crossed the room and was standing near him. Not close. There was a chair between them, and she wasn't making a move to close that distance. She looked like she'd aged a specific amount since the morning, in the way people do when a day has put something on them that won't fully lift. "Mr. Ryder," she said. "Miss Sinclair." She looked at the canvas bag on the table. She'd looked at it before, he remembered. That first morning on the tarmac, the assessment in her eyes as quick and automatic as a price check. She looked at it differently now, or maybe she just looked at it. He wasn't sure. "The people whose warnings were ignored," she said. "Derek Foss. Claire." She stopped. "How many others?" "I don't know," Mason said honestly. "The investigation will probably tell you." "Was it?" She stopped again, reformulating. "In your experience, when something like this happens inside a company, does it ever start because someone made a deliberate decision to be careless with people's lives? Or does it always start somewhere smaller than that?" He thought about it, because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "It usually starts with a decision that feels manageable," he said. "Someone decides that a risk is acceptable and nothing bad happens, and that outcome gets recorded as evidence that the decision was right. So the next decision is a little easier to make. And then the one after that." He picked up the canvas bag. "By the time it becomes a policy, nobody's thinking about the original decision anymore. They're just maintaining the policy." She took that in. Her jaw worked slightly. "That doesn't make it better," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He lifted the bag to his shoulder. "The investigation is going to run for a while. You'll be dealing with this for some time." "I know. The people who kept records, Foss, Claire, they did a harder thing than I did," he said. "They were inside it. They had more to lose." She looked at him. "You didn't have nothing to lose." "No," he said, "but different things." He moved toward the door. Behind him, the conference room was emptying. Chairs pushed back, papers gathered, the sound of people returning to whatever came next. Through the window at the end of the hallway, the Fort Worth afternoon was giving way to something cooler, the light going amber and low across the parking lot where his truck sat with its grinding wheel bearing and his son's school notification still on the passenger seat. He thought about Caleb and the soccer ball in the grass. He thought about Sandra, who always made the sandwich before she was asked. He thought about Laura, briefly, the way he sometimes did at the end of days that had required something from him. Not with grief anymore exactly, but with the awareness of her absence, which wasn't the same thing. He pushed through the door to the stairs and started down, one floor, the sound of the session receding behind him, and outside it was late afternoon in Texas, and the world was ordinary and enormous, and his truck needed a wheel bearing, and he was hungry, and he still had to file a supplemental report by Friday, and all of it, every bit of it, was exactly as it should be. The supplemental report took Mason most of Thursday to finish. It was a different kind of document than the initial inspection report, less about what he'd found in the mechanical bay and more about the context surrounding it, the sequence of decisions that the FSDO review had surfaced, the way the physical evidence and the paper trail had confirmed each other at every point. Tillman had asked for it by Friday, and Mason had it done by 3 in the afternoon and filed it at 3:17, which was as close to on time as he ever got when something ran long. He sat back in the chair in the water heater room and listened to the house. Caleb was at school. Sandra had done the morning drop-off because Mason had started the report at 5:30 and hadn't stopped. The wheel bearing had been fixed the day before. He'd taken the truck in first thing Wednesday morning and left it, and walked 2 miles to a diner where he'd eaten eggs and read the inspection manual for a turboprop he was due to look at next week. The grinding sound was gone. The truck drove the way trucks were supposed to drive, quietly and without complaint. And the absence of the noise had created a small specific silence that he kept noticing. He closed his laptop and did the things the house required. Dishes. A load of laundry that had been in the washer since Tuesday. He found Caleb's soccer ball in the backyard and brought it inside. Not because it needed to come inside, but because the rain they were getting tonight would have sat in it and made it smell like wet rubber for a week. And Caleb wouldn't notice, but Mason would. He was making dinner when his phone rang, and it was Tillman. "Report looks good," Tillman said. "FSDO compliance office is moving forward. They've expanded the fleet audit. All 14 aircraft are being reviewed by an independent team starting Monday." "How broad is the compliance action going to go?" "Broad enough." Tillman's voice had a careful quality. "Thomas Garrett has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Hargrove resigned this morning." Mason stopped stirring. "Resigned?" "Effective immediately. No statement from the company yet." A brief pause. "Braddock's firm withdrew as counsel this afternoon." Mason thought about Braddock in the conference room. The controlled face, the scorekeeping expression, the moment during Claire's presentation when something had shifted behind his composure. A lawyer leaving a client midway through a federal investigation was a particular kind of signal. It meant the math had changed. "What about Aurora Sinclair?" Mason asked. "She's still in her role for now. The board is meeting next week. Langston, the investor, has retained his own legal counsel and is requesting a full independent audit as a condition of any continued investment discussion." Tillman paused. "He also submitted a letter to the FSDO this morning." "About what?" "About you, mostly. It's complimentary." Another pause. "He wants to talk to you." Mason started stirring again. "About what?" "He didn't tell me. He asked for your contact information, and I told him you'd need to agree to the contact first." What do you think he wants?" "I think he's a 71-year-old man who has seen a lot of people in your position do the other thing, and he's curious about the version of events where someone didn't." Tillman let that sit for a moment. "You can say no. I'll relay it." Mason thought about it. "Give him my number," he said. "Done." A beat. "Mason, good work this week." Tillman didn't say that often. When he did, it was never elaborate, just those 3 words in that order, and then he moved on. It was enough. Mason thanked him and hung up and went back to the pasta. Holtz. Victor Langston called the following morning, Saturday, at 8:15 p.m., early enough that Mason was still on his first coffee and Caleb was still asleep, which was the weekend inversion of their usual schedule. He answered it sitting at the kitchen table with the back door open and the yard visible and the air carrying the particular cool wetness of after rain. "Mr. Ryder," Langston said, "thank you for taking my call." "Mr. Langston." "I'm going to be direct because I find that's usually better than the alternative." He had the same quality on the phone as he'd had on video, measured, unhurried, but with a density to the words that suggested they'd been selected carefully before being spoken. "I've been in aviation investment for a long time. In that time, I've encountered perhaps a dozen people who held the kind of standard you held this week, under the kind of pressure you held it under. And I've watched most of those people get worn down by the institutional friction that follows, because being right in a room full of people who don't want you to be right has a cost, and the cost is usually paid slowly, over time, in ways that are hard to document." Mason waited. "I want to offer you something," Langston said. "Not as charity and not as a transaction, as a professional proposition." He paused. "I'm establishing an independent certification program as a condition of any future involvement with Sinclair Aviation, and I've made a separate decision to fund it beyond the Sinclair context, a standing independent review board for the premium private aviation sector that operates outside any single operator's influence. I need someone to lead it, someone who will look at an aircraft the same way whether the person who owns it is watching or not." The yard was bright in the post-rain morning. A bird was doing something repetitive in the tree near the fence. Caleb's cleats were on the back step, caked with dry mud from a game 2 weeks ago that neither of them had gotten around to cleaning. I'm an inspector, Mason said, not an administrator. The role isn't administrative. It's technical and ethical. The administration is other people's job. Langston's voice carried the slight impatience of someone making a distinction he'd had to make before. I need someone who understands aircraft and who cannot be bought or pressured. The organizational part I can build around that. What I can't build is the foundational thing. Mason was quiet for a moment. Why me specifically? You looked me up during a recess. That's 20 minutes of research. It's 31 years of pattern recognition, Langston said. I looked you up to confirm what the pattern was telling me. Those are different things. A brief pause. I also spoke with Gary Tillman this morning, and with Derek Foss yesterday. What did Foss say? He said you called him the night before the review session to ask how he was doing, not about the case, just how he was doing. Another pause. He said nobody else had called. Mason looked at the cleats on the back step. I'd need to keep my independent contractor certifications, he said. Obviously. I have a son, 8 years old, travel has to be manageable. We'll structure it appropriately, base of operations wherever you are. I'm in Denton. Then Denton. No hesitation. Mr. Ryder, I'm not asking you to become a different person. I'm asking you to do what you already do, with more resources and a broader mandate. Mason finished his coffee. It had gone cool at some point during the conversation. Let me think about it, he said. Of course. A pause. How long do you need? A week? I'll call you next Saturday. And Langston hung up, which Mason appreciated. No extended closer, no sell, just the clean termination of a man who understood that more words wouldn't help. He was thinking about the call, not obsessively, but in the background, the way you carry a decision that isn't urgent but is real. When Aurora Sinclair appeared at his maintenance hangar on a Tuesday afternoon 11 days after the FSDO review. He didn't know she was coming. There was no call, no appointment. He looked up from an avionics panel he had partially disassembled on the workbench, and there she was, standing in the open bay door of the hangar with the afternoon sun behind her, and for a moment the backlight made it hard to see her face clearly, just her outline. Is this a bad time? She said. It was a question he hadn't expected from her. He set down the tool in his hand. No, he said. Come in. She stepped inside. The hangar was modest, one of the smaller units at the Denton Municipal Airport Complex, which catered mostly to private owners and small operators. Mason rented it on a monthly basis for the equipment he couldn't store at home, the reference aircraft he periodically used for comparison work, and the general administration of the inspector life that didn't fit in the room with the water heater. It was functional and slightly disorganized and smelled of aviation fuel and machine oil, which was a smell Mason had stopped noticing years ago. She looked around the way people look around unfamiliar spaces when they're trying to orient themselves without appearing to do so. Her eyes stopped on the canvas bag, which was hanging on a hook near the door, the same hook it always hung on when it wasn't on his shoulder. She was dressed differently than she had been at the airport or at the FSDO session. Less constructed. Dark jeans, a simple jacket, no security detail visible, no car with a driver idling outside. She'd come alone. He could see her car through the hangar door, a dark sedan parked in the lot, and it was just a car. I should have called first, she said. It's fine. She looked at the avionics panel on the bench. What are you working on? Radio navigation unit. Owner reported intermittent signal dropout. Usually a connector issue, sometimes a solder joint. He gestured at the stool near the bench. You can sit. She sat, and the fact that she did, that she took the industrial stool without hesitation and put her hands in her jacket pockets and sat across from him while he stood at his workbench, told him something about what 12 days had done to her, or for her. The studied arrangements of the woman on the tarmac had given way to something more straightforward. I spoke with my board last Wednesday, she said, and with Victor Langston on Thursday. She paused. Robert Hargrove was terminated formally, not just resigned. Thomas Garrett is being referred to the compliance investigation. There are 2 other executives whose roles are under review. She said it in the tone of someone reading a list rather than celebrating it. Derek Foss has been offered the permanent head of maintenance position, with full authority over the maintenance budget independent of operations. He accepted. That's good, Mason said. Claire Donovan has been offered a new role. Chief Safety Officer, newly created position, reporting directly to me. She paused. She hasn't decided yet whether she's going to take it. I can see why she'd be cautious. Yes. Aurora looked at her hands in her jacket pockets, or at the invisible things they were holding. I owe her more than a title. You do, Mason agreed, and said it without softening it, because she hadn't come here for softening. She looked at him directly. I owe you an apology. I've been thinking about how to say it for almost 2 weeks, and I haven't gotten it right yet in my head, so I'm just going to say it the way I know how to say it, which might not be the right way. That's fine, he said. I treated you like you were less than what you were because of how you looked and what you were carrying. She held his gaze. I did it automatically, before you had said a single word to me, and I gave that instinct authority it shouldn't have had. That was wrong, not as a business error, as a failure of basic decency. Mason had received apologies of many varieties over the course of his life. Some were performances, and some were negotiations, and some were genuine. This one was the last kind, specific enough to be real, uncomfortable enough to be honest, with no maneuver inside it that he could detect. I accept that, he said. She nodded once, then, but I want to say something else, and this is the part I'm less certain how to frame. She shifted on the stool. What you found, the valve, the records, it wasn't the thing I'm most ashamed of. What I'm most ashamed of is that I was running a company where people like Derek Foss had been raising alarms for over a year, and I didn't know. And the reason I didn't know is that I had built something between myself and the operational reality of that company. I surrounded myself with metrics and presentations and people who knew their job was to make things look manageable. She paused. I was not in the mechanical bay. I was never in the mechanical bay. No, Mason said. When was the last time an executive was in the mechanical bay? Based on the maintenance records? Not recently. She was quiet for a moment. I've been flying since I was 24. I learned on a Cessna 172 at a small airfield in Georgia. I loved it because there was no distance between me and the machine. You could feel everything, every change in the air, every response. And somewhere in building this company, I stopped being someone who understood the machine and became someone who managed the reporting structure that oversaw the people who understood the machine. She stopped. And people almost died in my machine. Mason set down the tool he'd picked back up without thinking and looked at her. They didn't, though. Because you came in carrying that bag. Because Foss kept records. Because Claire made copies. Because there were people inside your company who knew something was wrong and found ways to preserve that knowledge, even when the organization was telling them to let it go. He looked at the canvas bag on the hook. I was just the one who looked at the airplane. She followed his gaze to the bag. She laughed at you the first morning, Aurora said. When you were walking across the tarmac, one of my assistants, she leaned over and said something about the bag and I didn't stop her. She paused. I've been thinking about that too. People have judged me by the bag before, Mason said. It's not the worst version of that I've dealt with. Still, he agreed. They sat in the hangar for a while longer. She on the stool, he at the bench, the avionics panel between them like a project neither of them was currently working on. A plane passed low overhead on approach to one of the runways, the sound of it filling the hangar completely for 3 or 4 seconds and then receding. They both looked up at the ceiling involuntarily. Will you take the Langston position? She asked. He looked at her. You know about that? Victor told me, not the details, just that he'd spoken with you. A pause. He's a good judge of people. Better than me, apparently. He's had more practice failing, Mason said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. I haven't decided yet, Mason said about the position. I need to think about what it means for how I work. I've been independent for 7 years. There's something about being independent that matters to me. Because you can say no to anyone. Because no one else's interests are inside the inspection when I do it. He picked up the tool again, turned it in his hand without using it. The moment you're inside a structure, the structure has interests, and structures protect themselves. What if the structure was designed specifically to prevent that? Then it still has the design to protect, he said. Nothing stays purely itself for very long. She looked at him for a moment. That's a lonely way to work. It's an honest way to work, he said. Those are sometimes the same thing. She stood from the stool. She didn't make a production of leaving, just stood, straightened her jacket, the way someone does when they've said what they came to say and don't want to extend the moment beyond its natural end. The people whose warnings I ignored, she said, Foss said the same thing you said at the FSDO session, that they did a harder thing than you did, that they were inside it. She picked up her jacket from the bench where she'd set part of it. What do you do with that? How do you... She stopped, looked for the words. How do you make it mean something other than a lesson? It was the most honest question she'd asked him. You go back into the building, Mason said. Not with a lesson, with a different set of eyes. He paused. The lesson is just information. The eyes are the thing. That takes longer. She nodded slowly, and it was the nod of someone who was accepting something as a task rather than absorbing it as comfort. Thank you, she said, for seeing the airplane. She walked out through the hangar door and into the afternoon, and he heard her car start and the sound of it leaving the lot. And then the hangar was quiet again except for the normal sounds of an airport. A distant engine running up, the radio from somewhere, the broad white noise of a place where things moved and landed and moved again. He called Victor Langston the following Saturday as agreed at 8:50. Caleb was again asleep. The kid could sleep until 10 on Saturdays, which Mason found both impressive and useful. The yard was dry this time, the cleats still on the back step because he'd washed them, and they were drying, which was at least progress. I'll take the position, Mason said, with conditions. Name them, Langston said. I keep my independent contractor status for inspections outside the program's scope. If I'm asked to certify something by the program and my independent judgment says it shouldn't be certified, my judgment leads. No committee, no consensus process. Agreed. Travel is planned in advance, nothing on less than 3 days' notice unless it's a genuine safety emergency, and the definition of genuine safety emergency is mine, not the program's. Reasonable. And I want Claire Donovan on the advisory board if she'll do it. A pause. She understood what she was looking at before I was anywhere near that aircraft. That kind of understanding belongs in the room where decisions get made. A brief silence. I'd already considered asking her, Langston said. I'll reach out this week. Then we have a deal. Good. And Langston said something Mason hadn't expected. My father worked in a shipyard his whole life. He had a canvas bag he carried his tools in. My mother threw it away when he retired, and he never got over it. A pause, almost amused. I noticed yours. Most people do, Mason said. Most people see the bag, Langston said. You know what I mean. He did. He thanked Langston and hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen with his coffee. Quote, the months that followed were ordinary in the way that meaningful things often are, once the acute part is over. The FSDO investigation ran its course. Thomas Garrett was referred for federal prosecution on maintenance record falsification charges. Hargrove negotiated a settlement that involved, among other things, a permanent bar from aviation management roles. The fleet audit cleared 9 of Sinclair's 14 aircraft without major finding and identified component issues on 3 others, none as severe as what had been found on N4-470SH, but all requiring attention that the previous maintenance regime had deferred. Derek Foss rebuilt the maintenance department the way someone rebuilds a house that has been badly neglected. From the foundation, without shortcuts, without pretending the previous structure had been sound. He hired 2 additional licensed mechanics, revised the inspection cycle documentation, and instituted a standing policy that maintenance flags could be escalated directly to him, regardless of the reporting chain. He was not a warm man or a particularly inspiring one, but he was thorough, and thorough was the thing the job required. Claire Donovan accepted the chief safety officer position after 3 weeks of deliberation that she later described, to Mason, as the worst 3 weeks of her professional life. Every day I thought I was going to say no, she told him, in a phone call sometime in late November. And every day I thought about the alternative. Someone else in that role who hadn't kept the records, who didn't know what was in them. And I couldn't make myself walk away from it. I know, Mason said. You made the same decision with the Langston position. More or less. Is it worth it? She asked. The structure. All the things you have to navigate that you didn't have to navigate before. He thought about it honestly. "Ask me in a year," he said. She laughed, which was the first time he'd heard her do that, and it sounded like a person who had needed to do it for a while. The Langston Aviation Safety Initiative, the formal name for the program, which Mason had no input in choosing, held its first independent review in December, covering 2 charter operators in the Southeast whose maintenance practices had been flagged through industry channels. Mason led both reviews. He brought 2 other inspectors with him on the second one, which was the beginning of building the team. Langston had said other people would handle, but which, in practice, Mason found himself involved in because the people doing the building kept asking him questions he had opinions about. He was not a natural administrator. He made this known repeatedly. Langston's program director, a woman named Henley, who had the organizational capacity of someone who should have been running a small country, quietly translated Mason's technical judgments into the structural language the program required, which was an arrangement that suited both of them. Caleb turned 9 in February. The birthday party involved 7 other 8- and 9-year-olds, a backyard, and a quantity of pizza that exceeded Mason's estimates by a significant margin. Sandra organized most of it, as she organized most things, with the same preemptive competence she'd applied to the sandwich. Mason assembled the flat-pack picnic table she'd ordered online, which took 40 minutes longer than the instructions suggested and resulted in 3 leftover bolts whose purpose he never determined. He put them in the canvas bag, in the small interior pocket where the federal grounding order had once been. He didn't know why. It was the kind of thing that happens when a habit is old enough. He was at Falcon Ridge Executive Airport on a March morning, 8 months after the grounding, when he saw the Gulfstream. It was not the same aircraft. That one had undergone full maintenance reconstruction and been returned to service 2 months prior under Derek Foss's direct supervision. But it was the same model, same configuration, same morning light on the fuselage. He was there for a different inspection, a different aircraft, a routine review that would take most of the morning and probably not yield anything interesting. He parked in the employee lot and picked up his coffee from the cup holder and got out with the canvas bag on his shoulder. And the morning was cool, and the tarmac was wet from overnight rain, and the airport was doing what airports do. The quiet, industrial choreography of things being prepared to leave the ground. A pilot he didn't know nodded at him from the stairway of a nearby aircraft. Not at the bag, not at the jacket. At him. The way you nod at someone whose work you know, and whose presence in a place means something about the quality of what happens there. Mason nodded back and walked toward the mechanical bay. He thought about Aurora Sinclair briefly, the way he sometimes did. She was still running the company. The board had not removed her, which was either a considered decision or the path of least resistance, and probably some of both. What he knew from Claire was that she had changed how she operated, was in the maintenance facility herself twice a month, asked questions that suggested she understood what she was looking at, and had stopped surrounding herself exclusively with people whose job was to translate complexity into reassurance. Whether that change was permanent or situational was not something he could know from the outside, and it wasn't his job to know it. His job was the airplane. He opened the mechanical bay and shone his flashlight inside and started looking. The bay was clean. The components were correctly labeled, correctly installed, the documentation in the log precise and dated and signed. He moved through the inspection with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that the ordinary thoroughness of doing it right was not a lesser version of the work. It was the work. Most of the time, nothing was wrong. Most of the time, you opened the bay and looked and confirmed that what was supposed to be there was there, functioning as designed, within tolerances, carrying nothing invisible in its structure. And sometimes when you put the light at the right angle, you found the fracture. Both things were the job. Both things mattered equally because the one that found nothing wrong was what made the one that found something possible. You could not have the inspection that mattered without the 10,000 inspections that didn't, and you could not do the 10,000 without believing that the next one might be the one where the light hit something that needed to be seen. He photographed what he found, documented what was clean, wrote the report. Outside, the morning had warmed into something brighter, the wet tarmac drying, the airport filling up with the day's movement. He signed the aircraft as airworthy and picked up his bag and walked back across the tarmac to his truck, which drove quietly now, without complaint. And he got in and drove back toward Denton and the room with the water heater and whatever Caleb had forgotten on the kitchen counter, toward the ordinary and necessary work of a Tuesday that asked nothing extraordinary of anyone and was better for it. The thing about carrying the same bag for 11 years was that it stopped being a choice at some point and became simply a fact, the way certain things become facts when you stop reconsidering them. Mason had stopped reconsidering the bag sometime around year 4, when Caleb was still small enough to be carried on a hip, and the bag had been on every inspection, in every mechanical bay, on every tarmac in 3 states. It had absorbed the smell of aviation fuel and old leather, and something else underneath that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He was thinking about none of this on the April morning he drove to Falcon Ridge for what had become a semi-regular commitment. The Langston program had contracted with 3 operators in the Dallas-Fort Worth corridor for quarterly independent reviews, and Falcon Ridge was one of the 3. The reviews were routine in the best sense of the word. Clean records, clean aircraft, the ordinary confirmation that things were as they should be. He'd found 2 discrepancies in 4 visits: a hydraulic seal on a Challenger that was within tolerances but trending toward the edge, and a landing gear actuator on a Phenom that needed documentation updated. Neither had been dramatic. Both had been fixed. This was the work. This had always been the work. And the proportion of ordinary to significant was roughly what it had always been, which was heavily weighted toward ordinary, and that was exactly how it should be. He was halfway through the pre-inspection documentation review when he heard someone say his name from across the operations room and looked up to find Derek Foss walking toward him. Foss had put on a small amount of weight since the FSDO session. Not much, but enough to suggest that whatever he'd been carrying through the previous year had lightened enough for his body to relax slightly into itself. He looked like a man who was sleeping better. He moved through the operations room with the natural authority of someone who knew where every component was stored. "Didn't know you were on the schedule today," Foss said. "Quarterly review, N4-331 and N4-788. Foss nodded. "Both clean last I saw. The 331 had a fuel cap seal replaced 2 weeks ago. We documented it correctly this time." A slight edge on that last phrase, not sharp, just present. "I'll check it," Mason said. "I know you will." Foss pulled a chair from a nearby desk and sat in it without asking, the way people sat in spaces they considered their own. "You hear about the compliance ruling?" Mason had heard. The federal compliance case had concluded its primary findings 2 weeks prior. Thomas Garrett had accepted a plea agreement on 2 counts of maintenance record falsification and was facing a significant fine and a permanent bar from aviation industry employment. The prosecuting office had determined that while Hargrove had directed cost reductions with full knowledge of the maintenance implications, the specific falsification of work orders had been carried out at the mechanic level with indirect executive authorization rather than direct instruction, a distinction that had spared Hargrove criminal charges while costing him, through the civil settlement, a number that made Mason's annual income look like a rounding error. Pulaski, the mechanic whose signature had been on the original work order, had cooperated fully with the investigation. He was not prosecuted. He had also not returned to aviation maintenance work, and Mason didn't know if that was by choice or consequence, and hadn't asked. "I heard," Mason said. "You okay with how it came out?" Foss looked at the table for a moment. "I wanted more accountability higher up," he said. Hargrove knew. He knew for a long time, and he chose the budget over the aircraft. He picked up a pen that wasn't his from the table, turned it over, set it back down. "But Garrett goes to federal court, and Hargrove writes a check, and nobody who sat in those executive meetings and approved those directives is ever going to stand in front of a judge." He paused. "So, no, not entirely okay with it." "That's a fair position," Mason said. "Doesn't change anything." "No." Foss looked at the canvas bag on Mason's shoulder. "Claire's presenting to the Regional Aviation Safety Conference next month. She asked me if I'd speak alongside her." "You going to?" "Yeah." He said it without hesitation, which surprised Mason slightly. "She earned the right to ask." He stood back up, replacing the chair where he'd found it. "I told her what you said, about us doing the harder thing. I meant it. I know you did." Foss started back toward the bay. Then he stopped and turned back, the way people do when they've remembered something they almost let pass. "My daughter is taking her pilot's license exam in June. She's been training for 8 months. He said it in a way that didn't ask for a response, just offered it, the way you offer something when you want someone to understand that things have moved forward. She says she wants to be a commercial pilot. Mason said, she'll be good at it. He didn't know Foss's daughter. He had no basis for that statement. But Foss nodded like it was a reasonable thing to say and went back to his work, and Mason went back to his documents, and the operations room continued its ordinary morning around both of them. He was finishing the first inspection when his phone showed a text from Caleb's school. Not the office this time, but Caleb's teacher, Ms. Aldridge, who occasionally texted parents directly when something warranted it. The text said, "Caleb had a hard morning. He's okay. Call when you get a chance." He called between inspections, standing outside the hangar in the mid-morning warmth with the canvas bag at his feet. Ms. Aldridge picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Ryder, thank you for calling. Caleb's fine. I want to lead with that." He got into an argument with another student at recess. About his dad. About me. Another boy told Caleb that his dad was just a mechanic who fixed planes, and Caleb got very upset. A pause. He said some things about what you actually do that were quite detailed and articulate, and then he pushed the other boy. Mason closed his eyes briefly. He pushed him. He did. He's not in trouble. The other boy said something unkind first, and our policy is contextual. But Caleb's been upset all morning. He says he's not upset, but he cried in the hallway and told me he wasn't crying. Another pause, warmer. He's very much like you, I think, even though I've only met you twice. I'll come get him, Mason said. You don't need to. He'd probably prefer you didn't. He really is insisting he's fine. But I thought you should know. He thought about it. Can you put him on? A brief delay, then the specific quality of a phone being handed to a 9-year-old. Dad! Caleb's voice had the thickened quality of someone who had been crying and was trying to sound like someone who hadn't. Hey, bud. I'm fine. I heard. A pause. Ms. Aldridge told you the thing. She told me the thing. Mason looked at the tarmac, at the Gulf Stream sitting in its spot, clean and grounded and waiting to be cleared. You okay? Marcus said you were just a mechanic. Marcus is partially right, Mason said. I do work on aircraft. That's not all you do. No, but it's most of what I do. He paused. Caleb, you know what I do matters. You don't need me to explain it, and you don't need Marcus to agree. A silence. Not the silence of a child not listening, but the silence of one listening harder than usual. I know, Caleb said. Then let it go. He was being mean about it. I know. That's different from being wrong about it, and you know that too. Mason picked up the bag. Don't push people, Caleb. He started it. I know he started it. Finish school. I'll pick you up at 3. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'll be there at 3. He paused. You did a good thing standing up for it. The pushing was extra. A sound that might have been a laugh trying not to be a laugh. Okay, Caleb said, and handed the phone back. Mason stood in the sunlight outside the hangar for a moment after the call ended. He thought about what it meant to be 9 years old and have to explain your father to another 9-year-old, and about how the vocabulary for that was something a kid had to find on his own, mostly because the parent couldn't hand it over whole. He thought about Laura, about what she would have said to Caleb in the hallway, what specific words she would have used that Mason never quite had access to. She'd had a gift for finding the small sentence that carried the weight without showing it. He'd gotten better at it over the years. He wasn't hopeless, but he was still reaching for something she'd had naturally, and probably always would be. He went back inside and finished the second inspection. 3 weeks later, Claire Donovan called. It was a Sunday, late afternoon, and Mason was in the backyard watching Caleb work on a soccer ball against the fence. Not playing exactly, more practicing a specific move he'd seen in a video, and was attempting to replicate with the intense private concentration of a 9-year-old who didn't want to be watched while he figured something out. Mason was watching anyway, from the chair near the back door, with coffee that was already cold. I wanted to tell you something before the conference, Claire said, because I'm going to say some of it publicly and I wanted you to hear it from me first. What are you going to say? That the aircraft was found by you, she said. That's the obvious part. But I'm also going to say that the records were kept because someone taught me early in my career that the gap between what an organization says and what it does is the most important gap in any institution. And that your job, if you care about the institution, is to document that gap honestly, even when the institution doesn't want you to. A pause. I've been asked a lot in the last few months why I kept copies of everything, and the honest answer is that I don't fully know. It wasn't a plan. It was more like a response to a feeling I couldn't ignore. What feeling? Mason asked. That someone was going to need to know, she said simply. Eventually. That these decisions were going to produce an outcome, and when they did, someone was going to need the record to be real. She paused. I kept thinking about the passengers, people who booked a charter flight and handed over their trust in exchange for a ticket. They didn't know about the valve. They didn't know about the budget directives. They just got on an airplane and assumed that the people responsible for that airplane had been responsible. Most of the time, the people responsible are, Mason said. I know. That's the thing that makes the exceptions livable somehow. That they're exceptions. Another pause. I wanted to say thank you. Not for the review, not for the grounding order, for calling Derek the night before, for asking how he was doing. That mattered to him in a way that's hard to overstate. It was a phone call, Mason said. It was a phone call at 9 o'clock from someone who had no obligation to make it, Claire said. That's different from nothing. He didn't argue the point. Caleb had finally landed the move he'd been working on, some kind of step-over maneuver that resulted in him tripping slightly but maintaining control, which was a reasonable approximation of success for a first real attempt. He looked up and found his father watching, and for a moment had the 9-year-old's automatic embarrassment at being observed, and then decided it didn't matter and tried it again. The conference goes well, Mason said to Claire. Call me after. I will. A brief pause, the kind that had something in it. Mason, do you think people change? Actually change, not just adjust their behavior while someone's watching? He thought about Aurora Sinclair in his hangar, sitting on the industrial stool with her hands in her jacket pockets, and the quality of her apology. The specificity of it. The discomfort, the absence of maneuver. He thought about Foss and his daughter and the pilot's exam in June. He thought about the 3 leftover bolts from the picnic table assembly sitting in the interior pocket of the canvas bag and the federal grounding order that had been in the same pocket a year ago and all the different things a pocket could hold. Some of them do, he said, not because they get scared enough or lose enough. The ones that actually change, it's because they looked at something clearly enough that looking away became more uncomfortable than changing. He paused. It's rare, but it happens. How do you tell the difference? You can't always, he said. You watch what they do when nobody's checking. Victor Langston came to Denton in May. Not for a business meeting. He called ahead and said he was passing through Dallas on other matters and asked if Mason was available for lunch, which Mason understood to mean that Langston had arranged to be passing through Dallas for this specific purpose and was being tactful about it. They met at a diner near the airport, the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that arrived without being requested, and Langston ate a turkey sandwich and looked out the window at the flat Texas afternoon with the mild interest of a man for whom geography was mostly context. The program is working, Langston said. I've had 3 operators contact me asking to be included in the independent review cycle. Not because they're required to, because they want the certification. Oh, that's how it should work, Mason said. It's how it rarely works. Langston drank his coffee. When you build something that people want to be part of because it means something rather than because they have to be, that's the hardest version to build. He set down the cup. How's your son? The question came without transition, which was something Mason had come to understand about Langston. He moved between professional and personal without announcement, the way people did who had stopped maintaining a hard border between the two. He's good. He's playing soccer now. He's not particularly good at it yet, but he's very serious about getting better. How old? 9 in February? Langston nodded. He looked out the window again. I had a son, he said. He died 11 years ago. He was 34. He said it the way people say things they've said many times and have made a kind of peace with the saying, even if not with the fact. He was a pilot. Commercial, not private. Good pilot. The kind of pilot who was a good pilot because he was a careful person, not because he was fearless. He paused. Careful people make the best pilots, in my experience. The fearless ones worry me. Mason didn't say he was sorry. Langston didn't seem to be inviting it. Is that why? Mason asked. The program. Langston looked at him. Partly. It would be dishonest to say it wasn't. He picked up his sandwich and set it back down. I've spent 30 years making money in an industry that moves people through the sky in metal containers. At some point, you have to ask yourself what that means and what you've done with the access you've had. He paused. My son died in a car accident, not an aircraft incident. So it's not, the program isn't grief redirected. It's more that his death made me stop pretending I would get around to certain things later. What things? Making sure the people who hold the standard have somewhere to stand, Langston said. That's all. Someone like you, in the system we had before, you could be isolated, discredited. Braddock had a playbook, and it was a real playbook, and it had worked before. He looked at his coffee. I can't fix the whole system, but I can make it harder for that playbook to work. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a small plane was on approach to one of the general aviation runways. Visible through the diner window, low and steady, the landing gear already down, making the small corrections that flight always required right up until the moment the wheels touched. He would have liked you, Langston said, still looking at the plane. My son. He was the kind of person who recognized other careful people. He looked back at Mason. He collected them, actually, his whole life. Surrounded himself with people who did things properly, not for recognition. People who couldn't help being thorough. A brief, genuine smile. He would have had a lot to say about that bag. Mason looked at the canvas bag on the chair beside him. Most people do. He would have said it was exactly right, Langston said. That a man who carries a bag like that into a room like that has already made the important decisions before anyone opens their mouth. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and Langston seemed to understand that the silence was sufficient. They finished lunch and walked out into the May afternoon, which was warm and direct, and smelled of cut grass from somewhere nearby. Langston's driver was waiting with a dark car, and he shook Mason's hand and got in, and the car pulled away with the quiet efficiency of things that cost a lot of money and worked as intended. Mason stood in the parking lot for a moment with the bag on his shoulder. Somewhere behind him, the diner was doing its Tuesday afternoon business. The clatter of dishes, a radio at low volume, someone laughing at the counter. Ahead of him, the road back to the airport, and the truck, and the drive to Caleb's school, and whatever needed to be bought at the grocery store, and the 100 ordinary demands of a Tuesday. He'd been turning something over in his mind for weeks, without quite looking at it directly, the way you approach a thing that you know is important and don't want to mishandle. It was the question Claire had asked, and Langston's answer had illuminated from a different angle. Whether what he did amounted to something beyond the individual inspection. Whether the accumulation of all those opened bays and flashlight beams and careful reports added up to anything larger than their parts. He wasn't naturally inclined toward that kind of thinking. He was inclined toward the next task, the next aircraft, the next document to be filed correctly. That was how he was built, and he'd mostly stopped apologizing for it. But standing in the parking lot with the bag on his shoulder and Langston's taillights disappearing at the end of the block, he thought about the pilot who had nodded at him on the tarmac at Falcon Ridge that March morning. Not at the bag, not at the jacket, but at him. At the knowledge of who he was and what his presence in that place meant. He thought about Foss's daughter, who was going to take her pilot's exam in June and would climb into an aircraft and put her trust in the mechanical chain of accountability that began somewhere with someone crouching in a bay with a flashlight. He thought about the passengers who never knew anything had ever been at risk. The people who had booked their charter flights and handed over their trust and arrived at their destinations and went home to their lives without ever understanding how close things had come to being different. Those were the people the work was for. Not the ones in the conference room, not the investigators, not even the inspectors. The people who simply needed the system to be what it said it was. Who couldn't protect themselves because they didn't have the information and the access. And so they trusted that someone else had both and was using them honestly. Most of the time, someone was. Mason was not a man given to ceremony or large statements about his own purpose. He'd been asked in 2 separate media requests, both declined, to talk about what it meant to be the person who had stopped Aurora Sinclair's aircraft. And both times he'd said no, because the question contained a misunderstanding he didn't have the patience to correct in public. The aircraft had stopped itself, in the relevant sense. He'd just been the one who looked at it. But there was something he believed, had believed for a long time, that the year's events had confirmed without changing, that the most important work was the kind nobody noticed when it was done correctly, that the inspection that found nothing wrong was as necessary as the one that found something, because you couldn't have the second without the first. That showing up with a worn bag and old tools and the same standard you'd always held, regardless of who was watching or what they thought of you when you walked in, that was not a small thing. It only looked small from the outside. From the inside, from the place where the decisions actually got made, it was the whole thing. He got in the truck. The engine started quietly, the way it had since the wheel bearing was fixed, the grinding silence replaced by ordinary mechanical function that expected nothing from him except that he drive. He drove. At 3 o'clock, he was outside Holloway Elementary with the truck idling in the pickup lane when Caleb came through the doors in the specific walking style of a 9-year-old who has had a good day but doesn't want to oversell it. He got in the passenger side and dropped his backpack between his feet and buckled his seatbelt and said, "Can we get food? We have food at home." "Different food." "What kind of different food?" Caleb looked out the window at the parking lot with the expression of a person constructing a case. "Tacos." Mason pulled out of the pickup lane. "There's a place on the way." Caleb accepted this without celebration, which was Caleb's version of celebration. They drove through the afternoon in the easy quiet that had taken years to build between them. Not the absence of conversation, but the comfort that meant conversation wasn't required to make the time feel inhabited. The bag was on the back seat. The truck drove straight and clean. At a red light, Caleb looked at the bag and then at his father. "Are you going to get a new one?" "The bag." Mason looked in the rearview mirror at the bag. "No? How come?" "It works," Mason said, "and it knows where it's been." Caleb looked at the bag for another moment with the focused appraisal of a 9-year-old deciding whether an adult's answer made sense. Apparently it did, because he turned back to the window and watched the city go by, and didn't ask again. The light changed. Mason drove.